year's 2013. Glad to have you one more time. And for those of you who are in the chat room, as you well know the drill, if you have any questions for either one of my guests this evening, just go ahead and post them. Now, being that we have two guests on the show tonight, please address the question to the guest in which you want the question answered. So, and without any further ado, I'm going to let you know about some background on both of my guests, both very intelligent and credible gentlemen. I'm real happy to have them on the show. The topic is chemtrails. What are they? And there are perspectives here, and I really feel it's necessary for us to know different perspectives that these gentlemen are, involved in. And we will cover the topic, all the way through: geoengineering, chemtrails, weather modification, solar radiation management, and the effects that they seem to be having on this planet at this time. This program tonight is intended to educate our guests, and we will be exchanging ideas. So if you have something that you want to say or ask in the chat rooms, or if you're going to be calling us later in the show, I would ask that you have some respect. You won't be tolerated on my show. All right, and without going any further, we don't have any announcements for the Truth Tonight tonight. We're going to jump right into the show. My guest, Mark McCandlish, has grown up in a military-dependent family and manifested an interest in aircraft and other modes of transportation from an early age. And this interest was augmented by an artistic and mechanical ability that initially grew out of the interest in dinosaurs, fossils, and science. So I think that's fascinating. And as a teenager, these interests shifted to cars, and Mark decided that he wanted to become a designer for General Motors. And he soon discovered that attending one of the premier automotive design curriculums offered in Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, California. And that was not going to be possible on the minimum wage that he was earning in the 1970s. So he went ahead and joined the U.S. Air Force and took advantage of the GI Bill, eventually passing through electronics school at Lowry Air Force Base in Denver, Colorado, and then on to his permanent duty station, McCord Air Force Base in Tacoma, Washington. And while at McCord Air Force Base, he performed repairs on bore-sighted, the infrared and radar-based MA-1 and ASQ-25 weapons control systems of the F-106 Delta Dart with the 318th Fighter Interceptor Squadron. Mouthful. His website is located on thetruthTonight.com. If you want to, it's all linked up there. And if you want to take a look at his website, it's markmccandlish.com. My second guest who will be joining us as well for the conversation is pilot Stephen Knuessel. And Stephen is currently employed as a commercial airline captain for the U.S. Airways Express carrier. Stephen was born in Lockport, New York, and moved with his family to Tuscaloosa, Alabama, when he was 12 years old. And he attended Tuscaloosa Academy and Northside High School. During this time, Stephen was inducted into the National Honor Society Forerunners, which is a division of leadership in Tuscaloosa, and he received numerous awards for his performance in academics, art, literature, and sports. As a veteran of the U.S. Navy, also, Stephen gave 6 years of honorable service to our country, doing his part to secure our freedom and liberties. Knuessel was accepted into the prestigious Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program and worked to maintain and operate a nuclear propulsion plant aboard the USS Pasadena, a fast attack submarine. After receiving an honorable discharge from the U.S. Navy, Stephen pursued a career in aviation and attended Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, Delta Connection Academy, and Regional Airline Academy. Now, while at Regional Airline Academy, Stephen was selected as Assistant Chief Pilot of the Airline Transition Program. And in this position, Stephen was tasked with creating course curriculum and taught commercial airline pilots aviation weather, advanced jet systems, aviation regulations, instrument flying skills, aviation health, and advanced aerodynamics. So these two men have something in common as well. So this will be a great conversation. Listen, also, both gentlemen are all about our rights, our civil rights, our freedom as well. And Stephen took it upon himself in 2010 to move forward with trying to help America. Protecting the civil rights of the people has been his passion. So he will be running again for Alabama State Senate in 2014. So you might want to pay attention to his future as well. So firstly, I'd like to bring on Mark McCandlish. Mark, welcome to the show, and thanks for taking the time today.
Hi, Roxy. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you so much. And then, of course, new to the show is Stephen Knuessel. Stephen, welcome to the show, and also you're a busy man, so thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And Mark, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Well, thank you, Steve.
Now, listen, this is interesting. Stephen, I think that the public is very interested in your perspective as well. So we're just going to dive right into this. What interests do you have, or how did you come about, the conversation about, let's just call it chemtrails or geoengineering? These jet contrails that persist in some cases for days, hours on end, and so forth. Being that you're a pilot and very experienced, I want to ask you, what do you think about all of that? Because I know that you've been in discussion groups trying to understand the subject matter. And what's your take on, let's call it chemtrails? What's your take on that?
Well, I have a unique perspective because I don't see the contrails from the ground looking up. I can actually fly up there and see what aircraft they're coming from and what's causing persistent contrails versus short contrails. And it's hard to explain it to people whose perspective is limited to the surface of the Earth. Because when people look up and they see one aircraft leaving a long contrail that persists for a while, and then they see another aircraft in the same sector of sky leaving no contrail, that's what kind of plays into the theory that, that one of the aircraft is actually spraying something. And there's a lot of confusion and disparity between the definition of a contrails, what's causing, quote unquote, chemtrails, and the significance of that. And so what I want to do is try to educate people on my perspective of what's going on through my education and background, and try to steer people towards a sensible solution that we can actually move forward on. The biggest thing is that those long persistent contrails are not aircraft spraying stuff. I mean, I fly every day up there, and it's just different. It's the same reason why you have a low cloud, and in the same sector of the sky you have a high cloud, and no clouds in between. It all has to do with the moisture content that's present in the air at that altitude. And it's hard for people to understand that because of the perspective on the ground. And the contrails, they are affecting the environment. And there are things that we can do to mitigate them. We can create a contrail avoidance program and ask commercial airlines to fly at altitudes that are less likely to produce long, persistent contrails. That's something that if we can agree on what's actually causing those long, persistent contrails, we can actually come together and come up with some kind of solution to mitigate that. The Air Force uses contrail mitigation programs so that when they go into enemy territory, that the enemy doesn't see the big arrow in the sky pointing to the aircraft. They're very particular about what altitudes they fly at, and they launch weather balloons and take measurements of the moisture content, temperature, and dew point, and they plan their flight paths accordingly. So I really just kind of want to discuss what contrails are, or chemtrails, if you will, and kind of try to clear up some of the misconceptions about it so that we can actually focus on stuff that's really going on, that's bad. Weather modification programs, they do exist. They're out in the open. We can work together to stop that, and also to mitigate these long, persistent contrails.
Excellent, and that's what I like about you, Stephen. Is you are always looking for a solution, and it's difficult, as you said, because there's in from your perspective, there's a limited understanding of what people are viewing. So I want to ask you, Mark, in light of what Stephen just said, is do you have a different perspective of these lingering contrails?
Well, I do. One of the things that I wanted to comment on regarding something that Stephen just said about not seeing these things from his pilot seat's perspective is that I know that in certain parts of the country that the concentration of aircraft in a given amount of airspace is much higher than it is out here in the western United States, where a lot of the chemtrails seem to be witnessed. And it seems to me that one of the policies that air traffic control has, and Stephen, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, is that they try to keep the widest separation possible between different aircraft, even aircraft traveling along the same corridor. And so it doesn't surprise me that he has not seen these things, given that the prevailing weather patterns are generally traveling from west to east. And so let's say you were traveling from Los Angeles to Seattle, you had another aircraft out ahead of you 100 miles or more, and a contrail comes along or a chemtrail is produced, the weather patterns would naturally carry it away from the same corridor that he might be traveling on. I mean, I remember I've traveled quite frequently by air myself, and I think there's only been a handful of occasions where I've ever even seen another commercial aircraft from the window, of the aircraft I was flying in. So, but as far as the chemicals and the allegation that there's something being sprayed out of these aircraft, there's not only the constituent chemicals that are described in the original Welsbach cloud seeding patents, which involve aluminum, barium, and strontium, but these things are showing up in the snow and in the snow melt, the water that comes from these snowpacks in the Sierra Nevada. And it seems to me that, at least as a strategy for weather modification, that one of the areas where you want to put these kinds of trails, if you have any kind of a program in mind, is that you want to go into an area of regional instability, which is something we have a lot of here in California because we have two mountain ranges. We have both the coastal mountain range, and we also have the Sierra Nevada. And so these are areas where the mixing process, if you will, caused by the uplifting of marine layer and air coming off the ocean is going to be quite a bit more intense. So it's a great place to kind of stir up the air and put this material into the air. Now, the interesting aspect about these materials is that they're not just an indiscriminate form of dust. These are actually nanoparticles. These are particles that are of a very specific size. They're all uniform in size. They're all spherical in shape. You can look at them under a microscope and you can see them. And so one of the things that's significant about that is that if you do want to perform weather modification and you know what the given size of these nanoparticles is when it's distributed into the environment, that you can actually paint these particles, the air mass where they are being distributed, with a particular frequency of radio frequency energy, radar, something like the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, HARP system up in Gacona, Alaska. These particles respond to this kind of material or these kinds of transmissions. And this is one of the same principles they used in the application of stealth technology, where they would embed particles like this in the pigment that they would put on stealth aircraft so that they would actually resonate at given radar frequencies and convert that frequency to heat, thereby reducing the radar cross-section of the aircraft. We can also see that these same particles, specifically gold and carbon nanoparticles, can be infused into a cancer patient, and that those particles can be stimulated, so to speak, by using radio frequency energy and actually heat up a tumor and kill the tumor, because these particles, particularly gold and carbon, will stick to malignant tissue and no other kind of tissue in the body. So it offers a new and unique non-invasive form of cancer therapy that was described or discovered by a a gentleman down in Florida, John Kanzius. You can actually see news reports about this on the web. So, it's clear to me that, there's obviously something going on. I know that there's a tremendous amount of skepticism about it, but if you look at just the production numbers of nanoparticle manufacturing since 1990, it has grown exponentially over the last 10 to 20 years, from just a few $100,000 to well over something like $7 billion a year just in the United States. So you take all these things into consideration, finding the material in the snowmelt, finding it in the soil, looking at the environmental impact of these things. I think it's clear that something is definitely being distributed in the air, and I certainly don't think that it's coming in this refined nanoparticle form from industrial production over in China. So, I honor and respect his opinion and his skepticism, but I respectfully disagree.
Thank you. And Stephen, with that in mind, is it even possible? Have you come across anything that could substantiate what Mark just said, that would actually maybe even help you to understand? I'm assuming that you've done a lot of research, Stephen, but to understand the possibility that I think one thing I heard that you both agreed to. You both agree that there are weather modification programs. So is it possible, Stephen, that these are the trails of weather modification programs, that this is part of that agenda?
No.
No.
I understand what Mark is saying, but when you look up and you see a long contrail, that does not mean that aircraft is spraying. I'm flying up there. My aircraft flies through those contrails. To kind of correct something that Mark said, the aircraft, we fly close together. Vertical separation above 29,000 feet is only 1,000 feet. So I will be flying on a jet airway, and 1,000 feet above me will be another plane. 1,000 feet below me will be another plane. I've actually taken the video that I had up on YouTube of Delta aircraft 1,000 feet above me, 2 miles in front of me, producing a very long, persistent contrail. The problem with the theory that these long, persistent contrails are spraying some kind of toxic substance is that I am flying through them with my passengers. And the air that comes into the cabin for pressurization and air conditioning and heating comes directly from outside. It's not recycled air. It comes directly from outside and is pumped into the cabin. So if there was a toxic substance being sprayed up there, I would be dead. Now, regarding weather modification programs and weather modification patents, those programs exist. I have friends that do cloud seeding. But cloud seeding normally occurs around 10,000 feet below the freezing level because you don't want those droplets of, they typically use silver iodine, which I completely think is not good for the environment, and I think we should pass legislation to stop weather modification programs, but they do exist. And those droplets, they can't go above the freezing altitude, otherwise they freeze, and they don't seed the cloud. So what you look up at the sky and see as long, persistent contrails, those are ice particles suspended at 29,000, 35,000 feet. Those particles aren't precipitating down for quite some time. When you finally see the contrail dissipate, the exhaust particles are still suspended in the air for quite some time. The visible portion that you see is nothing more than ice crystals. That's all it is ice crystals. So I totally disagree with the theory that the long contrails are associated with any kind of toxicity findings in snowmelt or soil. I mean, after a period of time, jet exhaust, the products of combustion will eventually precipitate down, but not for quite some time.
Stephen, I have a question for you very quickly. We're going to be taking a break in a couple of minutes, but it occurred to me what you were saying about the persistent jet contrails. Have you seen those all of your career? Have they always been there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, they have. And they've been around for quite some time. There was a song in 1976. I forgot the singer, but he actually wrote a song about the 6 persistent contrails that look like guitar strings out in your neck of the woods in Arizona.
Mm.
We see more of it now because we have there's so many more aircraft flying today than there was 20 years ago. Plus, our jet engines are high bypass turbofans, which create a different pressure and temperature signature in the air, which is actually more conducive to the formation of contrails. But they're just not intentional aircraft spraying stuff.
Now, I can understand that. And one more thing, would you, as a pilot, ever know, let's say if they attach sprayers to a plane or whatever, and let's just assume that they are spraying something. Let's assume that it's not coming out of the exhaust. You as a pilot would know that, right? You'd have to flip a switch, wouldn't you? Or you would know that this was attached to your plane or not?
It would greatly affect the flight characteristics of the aircraft. Weight and balance is a big deal on commercial aircraft. Sometimes I have to move a passenger from the front to the back just to make sure that we're in the weight and balance envelope. We do a pre-flight and post-flight inspection, and we open a lot of panels and stick our heads in a lot of places. And I would notice if there was anything added to the aircraft. The other thing is, mechanics are just average, everyday people. They're not going to be part of some conspiracy to harm others. You'd have to have so many people involved. There's random FAA inspectors that will crawl around the aircraft when we pull into an airport. There's just if it was a conspiracy, there would have to be so many people involved. It would be mind-boggling.
Right. That's understood. That's also been a thought as well. The amount of people in the cover-up, especially with commercial craft, it'd be interesting. And I still wonder if they could actually get that past anybody who's working in aviation. But you would probably think that along the way in a bar with a drink with somebody or somewhere along the line when you were talking to other people who are working in the industry that somebody would say something. And do you hear anyone in the industry talking about this at all? And welcome back. And as I had mentioned, we'll give Mark a chance to respond to this. Mark, Stephen brought up a couple of interesting things about the toxic aerosols, if indeed they existed, that Stephen, as a pilot, is flying right through them, and the air outside's being recycled back into the airplane. And as he said, by now he'd be dead if he was breathing all of this stuff. His opinion, of course. He did mention about the 1,000 feet between planes above and below, so that he is in a closer proximity than we had talked about. He mentioned as well that there's more air traffic, and therefore that is why we're starting to notice more and more of these persistent contrails or chemtrails, if you will. So, Mark, could the commercial airline industry actually pull off the spraying of toxic materials without people like Stephen knowing about it?
Well, I certainly think they could. Stephen was a nuclear propulsion engineer on a fast attack submarine. I'm sure he knows what top secret and security clearance protocols are. And it has to do mostly with things like need to know. And so if there is a strictly compartmentalized program that is overlapping into an area of commercial aviation, it seems to me that there would be people in the environment that would know explicitly what they're to do and what they're to talk about or not talk about, and where their area of responsibility is. I know that avionics mechanics don't mix with the people that are taking care of the waste material being taken out of aircraft. And, flight line mechanics, people who work on the engines, are not the people that are working on the sheet metal. It's just, they're different areas of responsibility. Anytime you deal with an aircraft, very complex machinery, everybody has their own particular kind of expertise. And people really don't appreciate it when you step over into their area and say, what are all those extra plumbing lines going through my wings? What's that all about? Not that Steve actually has the opportunity to climb up and look into the internal components of a wing, but one of the papers that I came across was a document from NASA, which goes into quite a bit of detail about the inclusion of aluminum oxide nanoparticles right in the fuel itself, not only in rocket propulsion, but also in aviation fuels like Jet A or JP9, JP8, and that the whole idea of putting these kinds of particles into the fuel is to enhance the amount of oxygen that is released during the combustion process, to enhance combustion efficiency. It increases the thrust of the aircraft engine. It gives you higher range. And because you've actually got what amounts to an oxygen supply sitting right in the fuel itself, albeit completely inertly, it also allows you to travel at much higher altitudes. Now, one of the other things that he was saying about the altitude at which the planes fly, the planes that I've been seeing here in California that have been laying down these persistent trails are flying in altitudes that would put them low enough for me to visually recognize the aircraft type with the naked eye. In other words, I can look up and say, oh, well, that's a 737, or that's a 747, or that's an Airbus 300, whatever it is. But it's only augmented by having a really powerful set of binoculars that I can, confirm what I suspect when I see these things. But they're not flying at really high altitudes. I would say less than 15,000 feet. And so, the idea that there's nothing being put into the air is kind of contradicted by the fact that we have the fallout material that you can see under the microscope. I mean, these microscopic spheres takes approximately 40 of these spheres to line up next to a single red blood cell. So it gives you an idea of how severely refined these materials are. But just in the snowmelt, we have environmental surveys that have been done throughout the Sierra Nevada, and I can send copies of the papers on this to Stephen, after the show. But we have something like 65,000 parts per million of aluminum showing up in the snowmelt coming off of Mount Shasta, for example, which is about 20,000 times what the normal background would be. And that's clearly not the byproduct of some industrial process occurring in China. It's surely not something that's just showing up from the volcanic environment of Mount Shasta itself. It's something that's coming from the sky. And so I think that there's plenty of evidence that there is something being put into the air. I mean, there are even papers that show clearly that they have certain kinds of polymers that they mix with the fuels that are being used to distribute this material, that when they get the mix wrong, they leave these, some people call them chem webs, but they look like spider webs dropping out of the sky. I actually have a sample of this material in my refrigerator right now that dropped out of the sky. I mean, the whole area where I live in Redding, California, we had these long polymer strands dropping out of the sky all over the Redding area one Saturday afternoon, and it was immediately after we'd had a number of these persistent contrails, chemtrails over our area the previous evening and the following morning. So, I think there's a clear connection between things that are happening in the environment and things that are being sprayed out of the back of these planes. For example, we know that the amount of aluminum that's showing up in the soil and in the fresh water, the streams and rivers and stuff in this area, are many orders of magnitude higher than what they should be normally, and that it's actually changing the alkalinity of the soil. It's changing the chemical composition of the water, and as a consequence, we are seeing a severe impact on the biology in the soil. For example, we've seen about an 85 to 95% die-off of the invertebrates in the fresh water and in the soil. And these are organisms that are vital to the breaking down of decomposing matter in the soil so that the materials will be produced that the plants can survive on. So, it's almost more important to forget about where the stuff is coming from. If you're really concerned about the environment and what kind of an impact these materials are having on the environment, regardless of where they're coming from, I think it's really important to look at the studies, the analysis that has been done by a number of scientists that I know personally, that shows that there's clearly something appearing in the soil that is not coming from any kind of an industrial source. It's right on the ground. All the facts seem to point towards something that's coming from the aircraft.
And that's another question for you, Mark. Could you address, the idea that Stephen is flying right through these other contrails, and that air is being recycled into the cabin of the airplane? And he made a good point. What would happen to us if Stephen's obviously flying quite a bit? This is his job. What would happen to Stephen if he was breathing this every day, all day? These, nanoparticulates of, let's say, strontium, barium, aluminum, etc. Manganese is part of it too. Stephen brings up a good point. Wouldn't he at least be feeling kind of sick?
Well, I have to imagine that the air goes through some kind of filtration system. I can't imagine they would just be blowing the air straight into the cabin from some kind of an inlet. That at the very least it would have to be warmed up before it was put into the cabin, or they'd all freeze to death too. So, I would have to defer to him and his knowledge of his particular aircraft, but the percentages of the materials that are being used vary quite a bit. For example, aluminum nanoparticles are showing up, I would say, on the order of about 80% of the total composition of the material that we find in the snowmelt and in the soil. Barium and strontium follow in that order, with barium being the next and strontium being last. Now, I'm sure that with Steve's study of various sciences, he understands that there's a certain amount of ionization that occurs in the atmosphere. Even when an aircraft is traveling through the air, you have static electric discharge wicks that are on the trailing edge of the aircraft wings to help to discharge the static electricity and so forth of the aircraft moving through the air. And when you have different levels of ionization, you change the conductivity of the atmosphere. And this is something that we've seen also with these kinds of chemtrails that show up directly before a storm front comes rolling through the area. We see up to 8,000 lightning strikes coming from a single storm. And, if you have a conductor like aluminum being sprayed into the air just before a storm front or a cold front comes into the area, you're going to be able to raise the level of ionization and conductivity of the atmosphere dramatically. And not only that, but the aluminum, when it hits the ground, especially in its oxide-coated form, which is described in the documents that I sent to Steve earlier, you find that it actually behaves like an accelerant in the course of a forest fire. It releases a tremendous amount of oxygen into the combustion that occurs during a fire, and so it makes these fires much more dangerous, much more difficult to put out, which is exactly what we've been seeing over the last 10 to 15 years. So I would dispute that. In fact, OSHA has a number of hazardous material data sheets that they put out regarding nanoparticle materials, including aluminum, and a lot of times you find that there's a big difference even between something like aluminum oxide, which is relatively harmless to humans in certain concentrations and certain sizes of the nanoparticles, but aluminum on the other side will actually suppress the ability of the white blood cells in the lungs to engulf and consume pathogens or contaminants that are inhaled through respiration. So it just depends on the level of exposure, the length of exposure. But I'd really like to hear whether or not the air coming in from outside is heated or filtered on those aircraft, because I believe that it has to be.
Yes, and I'm going to bring up that point very quickly here, and let Stephen go ahead and answer that. I do want to know something, though, on top of it. That would have to be a pretty hefty filter to filter out these tiny nanoparticulates, I would think. So I know there's not even a mask that you can wear at this point that those particulates can't get through.
That's true.
So,
that's true.
yes.
It's one of the big concerns in military vehicles, for example, and the environmental, nuclear, and biological filtration systems that they have for tanks and things like that in the military. There are some filter systems that will not be able to stop particles that are only 100 microns across. I mean, it's simply impossible. So it's a big concern.
Yeah, certainly. And Stephen, in regards to that, are there filters in the plane that the air from the exterior is being filtered into the interior? And what do you know about filters on the plane, if you know anything at all about that?
Yeah, I'm actually looking at a diagram right now of a air cycle machine, which is our air conditioning and distribution system. You can do an internet search and type in air cycle machine, and you can pull up the images and see the diagrams of that. What occurs is the engine actually takes, the air comes into the engine intake, it bypasses the combustion section of the engine, it goes through the compressors, and then is tapped off. That air is then directed through various heat exchangers and is mixed with air that didn't go through those heat exchangers, and then it's distributed into the cabin. So it is heated, it's not filtered. In order to filter out those nanoparticles that you're speaking of, on our nuclear propulsion plant, we had to deal a lot with nanoparticles. And we use ion exchangers to filter those out. So there are ion exchangers that are capable of filtering those types of particles out, and the military uses them quite frequently for biological and nuclear contamination and dealing with nanoparticles as a result of that type of substances.
Well, if I could just interject at this moment, I'm sorry to interrupt, but doesn't that kind of sort of answer your previous question and contradict it, where you were saying that if these things were coming into the plane, I'd be dead now? If in fact you have ion exchangers that are capable of filtering out nanoparticles, then that would explain why they're not getting into the cabin of the aircraft. Isn't that true?
We don't have ion exchangers on board here.
He's saying it only the military. He was talking about the military, but you don't have them on commercial jets, which brings us back to the point. Then we're right back at the beginning of that question.
Yeah.
Is that we're getting a high concentration of nanoparticles that he's flying through, and those are he just explained how that air comes back into the cabin, and those nanoparticles, it sounds like, are actually getting into the plane because they don't have an ion exchanger.
Wow.
Well,
and if they don't exist, here's the thing: if these nanoparticulates of strontium, barium, aluminum, etc., in these trails don't exist, this is possible. I'm just throwing this out there. If, in other words, wouldn't the airlines, if they knew this was all going on, wouldn't they put ion exchangers in the planes to protect the passengers?
You would think so.
Well, it's because the contaminants that you're referring to, most of them are byproducts of combustion. So there are particulates being emitted through the natural combustion process and being exhausted out of the jet engines. But the concentration's dispersed and it's not high enough. Jet engines are very, very efficient. Even though those particulates are present, they're present in a very small amount. Now, the cumulative effect on the environment, I mean, I'm sure that it has some impact, just like us driving our cars here on the surface of the Earth is having an impact on the environment. But to say that a soil test that results in a high amount of aluminum contamination or barium contamination is associated with a contrail that you see in the sky, I think that is a kind of a reaching conclusion. I don't think there's sufficient evidence to make that conclusion, and I think there's more evidence to refute it than to support it. When I'm flying, I mean, I can check the weather maps before I go into the aircraft, and I can see the temperature and dew point spread at 1,000-foot increments and forecast exactly where contrails are going to occur and where they're not. And I can go up there and see an airplane 2,000 feet above me producing a contrail, and as he descends, he'll get to my altitude, and that contrail will stop. Now, most chemtrail theorists would say, oh, his nozzle's turned off. And then as he descends further, he gets into a moist layer of the atmosphere, and all of a sudden the contrail is produced again. And people would say, oh, he's turning the nozzles on. But I can see with my eyes where that's emanating from, and it's the engines. It's not nozzles. It's coming out of the engines. And it's not anyone flipping a switch on or off, because I have just predicted exactly what altitude it's going to occur at. And in fact, NOAA and the Air Force, they have contrail prediction maps. That will tell you where there will be contrails and where there won't be contrails. And they're very accurate. I've posted them on your Facebook page before. You can also go to flightaware.com, and if you see an aircraft producing a contrail, generally you can go on there and it'll tell you exactly what aircraft it is, who owns it, where it's going, what altitude it's at. Regarding the claim that the planes are at 15,000 feet, I don't know how you can accurately make that assessment from the perspective on the ground. It's very hard to judge what altitude aircrafts are flying at from that vantage point. And I also think that if someone is trying to intentionally spray this stuff, if they're spraying it at that altitude below the freezing level, it's going to dissipate. It's going to evaporate. It's not going to hang in the air for a long time. And at that altitude, it's just going to precipitate out and drop. At the high altitudes, that's where it turns to ice, and it's suspended. And it's not precipitating down to Earth for days, sometimes even months. So I think that there's, I think that sometimes we're drawing conclusions that aren't necessarily definitively supported by the evidence. And I think we need more proof to make those connections.
Right. I appreciate that. And Mark, as far as what Stephen had just commented on, how you would know that a plane is at 15 or 10 from standing on the ground, do you have an accurate way of doing that?
Well, if I wanted to get it down to the number of feet in the wingspan, sure. I mean, it's simple. I mean, it's simple mathematics. You take an object that's a given distance from your eye, say 24 inches on a yardstick, and you measure the distance of wingtip to wingtip at maybe 3/16 of an inch, and you project it out to match the wingspan of a 747, which is the aircraft that, say, in this particular example, I recognize because of the design of the aircraft. You know what the dimensions of the aircraft are, and you know what the dimension of that gap that you're viewing it through is, and how far it is from your eye. So you project it out, and the mathematics, it's real simple. Just it'll tell you approximately how far away it is, within 1,000 feet. So it's a pretty simple process. I mean, but I would love to believe what Steve is saying, that it's just simple condensation, that it's ice nucleation occurring with particulate matter coming out of the exhaust of the engine. I would love to believe that that's true, but we've had an occasion here in the Reading area in the last 10 years where we had a day of heavy chemtrailing, what I'm referring to as chemtrailing. And a day and a half later, the newspaper headlines are that hundreds of people have been admitted to local area hospitals claiming problems with respiratory distress. And, this just the connection to events like that, the coincidence seems to be a bit of an indictment in my book, because there weren't any other factors that would have led to this. I mean, no increased pollen count, no forest fires, nothing else in the environment which would cause people to suddenly experience respiratory distress. But I mean, the fact that there are scientific conferences on weather modification and using nanoparticles specifically as part of an ice nucleation process, the science that's well defined that talks about being able to broadcast a radio frequency signal at particles suspended in the air and have those particles resonate and produce a heat up to like 135, 155 degrees, which in turn heats the surrounding environment, which in turn causes the air mass to rise, carrying all the moisture in that air mass to a much higher altitude where it's extremely cold, creating a very powerful low pressure system. And these are things that they're looking at right now as part of serious weather modification programs. Not to mention the fact that there's a very open discussion in the literature about putting particulate matters, things like titanium dioxide, aluminum oxide, other reflective materials into the atmosphere as a way of thwarting global warming and climate change. I mean, there's even government documents that specifically talk about using what they call weather-forcing aerosols. And when they talk about that, they're referring to nanoparticles. It's right in there's even a presidential executive order calling for the formation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that studies specifically all of these particular areas of being able to do something about what's happening with the weather. And so if you look at all of the possible ways of distributing or putting this kind of material in the air, certainly you can send up little rockets with an explosive charge that'll, poof out in the air and spread the stuff. But the most effective way to do it would be with commercial airliner traffic, simply putting it right in the fuel. And we know that this material works very well in an aircraft engine because, number one, it's so small, and number two, because it releases so much oxygen during the combustion process. It actually makes the airliner get better gas mileage, so to speak. So, it seems to me that, whether or not it seems logical, I don't really understand why they feel the need to modify the weather, unless, of course, things like the melt-off of polar ice is becoming so severe that they're actually concerned about loss of resources and real estate because of the sea level rising. And if and when that does happen, things like the state of Louisiana and Florida will just disappear off the map. They'll be underwater.
Correct. I have a question for Stephen as well, because we seem to be focusing in on, again, the actual jet fuel as well. Is it possible that this is being emitted through the jet fuel? It is not being sprayed like an aerosol through attachments on the side of the wings, let's say, or behind as Stephen said, he can see this coming out of the exhaust. So let's go with that point. He sees it coming out of the exhaust system, et cetera. Is it possible, Steve, do you know what's in your jet fuel? Have you ever tested your jet fuel to see if all of these exist? These nanoparticles exist in your jet fuel, the barium, the aluminum, the strontium. Have you ever done that to just see if it's in the jet fuel?
Well, of course, I haven't actually gone out there and personally tested it, but I can tell you that there are strict limitations to what they put into the jet fuel. We're starting to get a little confusion because we're talking about stuff that they put in the fuel to increase fuel efficiency, but then we're talking about stuff that they're putting in the fuel to create long, consistent contrails. And again, we're kind of jumping the track, so to speak, and making conclusions that really aren't related to one another. Are they putting stuff in jet fuel to increase fuel efficiency? Yes. They also put stuff in the jet fuel to kill algae. They put non-corrosive.
If you're just joining us, you're listening to The Truth Denied, and the conversation is regarding chemtrails, weather modification, SRM programs. We really barely even made a dent into the subject matter at this point. Our guests this evening are Mark McCandlish and, of course, pilot Stephen Knuessel, and real glad to have you both. So we were just talking about a little bit about the jet fuel. I think that's where we left off. And, ingredients in the jet fuel. And we're kind of going around and around trying to make a point about the different altitudes in which we can see these jet contrails, at 15,000, we shouldn't be seeing a chemtrail or a persistent jet contrail because it is not crystallizing at that point, or the vapor itself isn't crystallizing at that point. And yet some, as Mark had said, where he lives in California, has seen these persistent contrails or chemtrails at 15,000 feet, also associated with a heavy, what you call spraying day, and a lot of people in the hospitals on the news that evening with respiratory illness. So, kind of making an association between the two, or correlating the two, I should say. But let's get back to, if we can, let's not stay stuck on something here. Stephen had recommended that we do address weather modification programs, and of course, my question again would be, we know, we have a proving ground for weather modification programs. It's public information. As a matter of fact, climate policies are associated with it, and there are many climate policies coming out. And we'll address this later in the show. Solar radiation management. That's a whole nother ball game right there. That is out of the bag. SRM is out of the bag, and they are also spraying some pretty hefty concentrated nanoparticulates to help the planet. But before we go there to SRM, let's jump back into weather modification. And I'll ask you, Stephen, do you think at all it is possible that commercial airlines are even involved in either program, in solar radiation management or weather modification at all?
No, I do not think that they're currently involved. Mark had some valid points that are, they're factual. There are patents and scientists who want to put stuff in the jet fuel in order to mitigate global warming. That is a fact. It exists. There's no proof that they've ever implemented anything like that currently. And it's my observation that there's no correlation between contrails and any kind of effort to accomplish that, because of the observations I had talked about, where the contrails will come and go as the aircraft descends and climbs through various altitudes. If the government enacts one of these weather modification programs that they have these patents for, stratospheric, particulate induction, in order to mitigate global warming, we probably wouldn't even see it for the most part. We wouldn't know that it was going on. And that's one of the biggest problems that we have with this discussion that I keep trying to emphasize, is that correlation between what you see and what you don't. We focus on these long persistent contrails and attribute weather modification programs and geoengineering to those. And that's really not where our focus should be. Our focus should be on the things that we can't see. And, the current weather modifications typically cloud seeding. Out west, they'll cloud seed storms in order to mitigate hail damage to crops. Or sometimes in the desert areas, they'll cloud seed to produce rain. You can't see that occurring. They're spraying silver iodine in the air. You can call up one of the companies that are in the phone book, and you can pay them $10,000 to fly over your house and spray this stuff, and you'd look up and you wouldn't even see it occurring. And so that's my concern. And that's what I think we should start focusing on, is these known weather modification programs that are actively ongoing, that we can actively identify, and we should be assessing, is that really the best thing for the environment? Is that the best thing for our health? And I think we should start there, focus on the things that we can tangibly see and tangibly access as our starting point, and then start moving into some of these other areas. That's where I would like to see people start focusing on, so that we can actually do something.
And I can appreciate that. Even Mark and I have had discussions about going after the culprits of either a hidden agenda or weather modification or, solar radiation management stuff. Things that are just sort of reversing the health of the planet, or augmenting the health of the planet, I should say, and not so good, having some real bad effects on the environment. And the chemtrail aspect is a very difficult one. Because there's no teeth in it. And so I can appreciate what you're saying, Stephen. I truly can. Mark, what do you think about what Stephen's bringing up as well?
Well, I think this is the one area of common ground where we can really agree. I agree wholeheartedly with his position on this, that we should have some way of being able to know, and not just because we've been persistent with the Freedom of Information Act request. There's a section of the Chemical and Biological Warfare Statutes under Title 50 United States Code, which clearly says that any time any kind of a chemical agent is going to be released over the continental United States or any other U.S. territory, that notice has to be given to the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, that the governor of the particular state or region where this is going to occur has to be notified. It's generally prohibited except in times of war, but they also have exceptions. And of course, those exceptions are always something in the general language that says, when it's deemed to be in the interests of the national security and this kind of thing. So, there is a very clear set of protocols and requirements that are outlined in terms of notification that comes down from different agencies within the government. It's described right in the law. And so theoretically, if this kind of stuff is going on, that the governor of California, the governor of every other state where this is occurring, should be given a notice practically on a daily basis, because that's how often we're seeing this kind of thing. But the fact that, OSHA, the Office of Occupational Safety and Health Administration, they have very clear, as I was saying before, hazardous material data sheets that describe each of these particular kinds of chemicals: aluminum oxide, aluminum nanoparticles, barium, strontium, every one of these kinds of materials, even the additives that they put into jet fuel for anti-corrosion or antiseptic type additives, things that are supposed to be there for the benefit of the operation of these jet engines and so forth. All of these things have hazardous material data sheets. And so it really amounts to how much of this material is getting into the environment, how much is it getting down to the area where people can breathe it. And as far as not seeing things, of course, I've seen days when aircraft have flown overhead and there's absolutely no contrail at all. I've seen days when it's clearly coming from the engines, but I've actually seen an instance, and this has only occurred once, when I saw an Airbus 300 flying overhead, and it had this material coming off the entire trailing edge of the main wing. And that's it's something, couldn't have been the byproduct of being at a high angle of attack or in a stall or anything. The plane was just cruising along normally, but you just don't see that kind of stuff unless it's actually being released into the airstream around the wing. So it's clear to me that something's going on. When you look up at the sun and you see a white haze around the entire sun that persists for days at a time after these trails have been sprayed in the air, after you've seen these things, it's obviously something that's in the environment that people are breathing. And so, if there is some kind of weather modification going on, I think that the government at least owes us the courtesy of letting us know that they feel this is in their best interest or our best interest, and whether or not there are any kind of health hazard associated with this sort of thing.
Correct. And for both of you, that I think that is my issue as well with this whole thing, is the hidden agenda, if any, or the at least disclosure of exactly what they're putting out there, as Mark had said. And Stephen is saying the same thing as well. So I'm really glad we're unifying under one idea, which is disclosure of what they are using and why they're using what they're using and how to clean it up. And I think that's what I would like to ask with you, Stephen. If this is some type of air pollution, or like you said, you brought up a very interesting point, both of you have, the idea that you wouldn't see what is going on. That also makes sense to me. I always question, why would they just put this all in the skies, all, with us, screaming and yelling all day long, stop making all these grids in the sky. How would you define, Stephen, your approach with government? Would you ask for a disclosure, or would you throw a mountain of PDF files on their desk and say, we already know what you're doing and you need to stop? I mean, what's the approach?
Well, we already asked the government to address the issue of chemtrails, and they put together a panel with the EPA, NOAA, NASA, and they put out a report on it. And they reassured the public that the contrails were naturally occurring. They provided the scientific evidence behind it, and to reassure the public that, in fact, what you were seeing was a natural phenomenon as a result of combustion at high altitude and low pressure and very cold temperature. So we kind of already have approached the government and got our response. As far as the contrails go, what I would like to see as far as weather modification goes is strong legislation that prevents weather modification programs from being created and implemented. Because
aren't there already treaties in place for that? Aren't there already treaties that have been written about that and signed?
Weather modification, like I said, I have friends that do cloud seeding for a living. You know, they fly small aircraft with an array of sprayers, and they spray silver iodine in the clouds when someone calls them up and says, hey, there's a hailstorm coming, I don't want my crop damaged. And they go in there and they'll cloud seed that storm and put silver iodine into it to mitigate the formation of large hail. They do it in the desert to create rain, because the silver iodine creates a condensation nuclei for the moisture to condensate on, and it creates larger droplets. Those things, when you start messing with the natural weather patterns, when you start influencing Mother Nature and God's creation, I think that's trouble. And I think that they will just continue to come up with crazy chemicals and different methods to keep messing with the weather patterns and the environment, and I don't think that's good, and I think we can all agree on that. One interesting thing I just want to kind of point out what Mark mentioned earlier about his observation that he's witnessed material shedding off of a wing of, I believe it was an Airbus that he was referring to.
Right.
I have heard similar stories from quite a few people, and when I researched those specific instances, I have found that those people are correct. And the cause of it was the de-ice fluid that was applied to the aircraft. If an aircraft has frost in the morning, they're going to apply de-ice glycol fluid on the air all over the aircraft to de-ice and prevent ice from forming on the aircraft. When the aircraft takes off, that material will shed off, and as it'll stay on the aircraft and be dripping off of it while it's flying. You typically won't see it, but when that aircraft lands, I know when I de-ice my aircraft, I'll fly at 25,000 feet, and then when I land and walk around my aircraft, the glycol fluid's still dripping on me. So if someone saw me take off with that de-ice fluid applied to my aircraft, they might say, I saw an aircraft with stuff, quote,
I have a question.
Off the wing.
I have a question.
Sure.
Now, are you saying that that's something that you can dispense from inside the cockpit, or is that something they spray on the aircraft before you leave the airport?
Before we leave the airport.
Okay. Well, in the instance, because there's a program we have that you can get for your cell phone. You can also get on a computer where you can track individual aircraft and see where they came from, where they're going. This particular Airbus 300 had come from Sacramento, which is 150 miles away. So I think that flying at, over 400 miles an hour, at 15,000 feet or higher, that this stuff would have blown off long before it passed over Redding. And this was a persistent activity. I mean, this wasn't something that just was momentary, a little burst of moisture or something coming off the main wing. This was something that was coming off the entire trailing edge of the main wing from horizon to horizon. I was watching it through binoculars because it was really hard to believe what I was seeing. But it was persistent. It was not something that had been sprayed on the wings.
Well, you say take off from 150 miles away. I just have a hard time, no offense, but I just have a hard time that it was at 15,000 feet at a perspective that you could visually see it, especially clearing the California mountains. I mean, it's going to have to be much higher than that.
Well,
I
was watching it through binoculars, and whether or not it was specifically at 15,000 feet or not. The one thing I can tell you is it was large enough that I could see the entire wingspan with the naked eye, and then when I looked at it through some binoculars, it was obvious that the material that was coming off the aircraft was coming off of the entire trailing edge of the main wing, which is not something you would see with an aircraft that has individual engines. I've never seen anything like it before.
Yeah, I mean, we have to get stuff like that on video. A lot of the video that I've seen of there's a YouTube video of a KC-130 Air Force refueler, and people were trying to claim that was actually spraying stuff. And you watch the video, and it has a circle, and it says, "Look, here's a nozzle," and it's actually pointing to the flap bearings. Those aren't nozzles. Nothing was spraying out. It shows like a curtain of moisture coming up over the wing. The plane was actually in slope flight operations, and as it increased the angle of attack or the pitch of the nose, it creates low pressure over the wing, which caused it was flying in moist air, which caused the condensation. It was just basic principles of physics.
Sure.
I think that we need to get more videos and analyze the videos, and try to come up with some substantial proof of what's going on. Now, is the government flying an Airbus 319, 321 that's outfitted with nozzles and stuff? I mean, I don't know. I just don't see what the purpose of that would be. I mean, if the stuff is so toxic that it's such high concentrations in the soil, I mean, they're killing people. And you having been in the military, that these guys are not going to purposely go and kill their family members and other people of the U.S. population. I do not like our government, and I'm as radical as they come. And I know the government does a lot of bad stuff, but I just don't think that the servicemen and women are going to be purposefully spraying this stuff just blindly across our land. It just doesn't make sense.
Let me toss something in here. For example, I mean, I'm sure that most of the pilots in the U.S. military are patriotic, flag-waving Americans. They believe in the spirit of the founding fathers and the Constitution. I know that's how I felt about it when I was in the Air Force, and I'm sure you felt that way when you were in the Navy working in submarines. But the guy who's in the field, the guy with boots on the ground, the fellow who's in the cockpit, they don't always have personal knowledge, or even a need to know for that matter, of what the overarching mission statement of any given operation is going to be, simply because they don't have a need to know. I mean, and even if they're told, well, there's going to be some material in your fuel or coming out of your aircraft engines that's there to help shield the Earth from higher levels of ultraviolet light coming from the sun, and in fact, we know for a fact that is true, that the levels of ultraviolet A, ultraviolet B, and ultraviolet C in some cases are 3,000 times higher right now than they have been in the last 10 years, which is highly unusual. It's documented. I know people here in Northern California and across the United States who spent the money, a lot of money, to go out and buy very specific equipment that can detect the levels of ultraviolet light coming from the sun, and they are seeing levels that are off the chart. And in fact, when they try to put this documentation up on the net, it's almost immediately hacked and taken down. So it's curious to me that these things can be going on, and yet it's not getting any publicity. But when it comes down to somebody in the military or even someone in a commercial aviation environment where, something as ridiculous as pointing a UFO or reporting a UFO sighting can, get you kicked off the job as maybe having some kind of mental issues. You have to be very, very tight-lipped about the things that go on when you're flying, because not only is the reputation of the airline on the line, but your own reputation as a pilot, as someone who's mentally sound for operating a complicated machine is always going to be something that we'll look at. So I really feel like there's just so many issues surrounding this, and whether or not the people who are operating the aircraft would ever be told is something I have a lot of doubt about.
Well, I don't think that people would be afraid to speak up. If you Google my name and put UFO after it, you'll see that I have cited a UFO and submitted a report. There's a lot of pilots that are like me, and they're not afraid to speak up. And I would say the majority of them are not afraid to speak up because we stick together, we have a strong union, and we really care about doing our job well and providing good customer service and caring for the environment as well, as best we can, as far as, limiting our emissions and, conserving fuel. So I don't think that that's necessarily the case. If it was such a broad conspiracy, I think there would be someone to blow the whistle. It's your comment about the increase in UV radiation. Again, this is another observation that you really can't connect to chemtrails, because if the chemtrails are a result of aluminum spraying in the atmosphere, which is reflecting sunlight, then that would reflect the UV radiation, and our UV radiation would actually be lower. So that would kind of refute the argument that aluminum is being purposely sprayed in the atmosphere.
Excuse me, Steve, but that's actually the point I was trying to make, was that might be exactly the reason why they're putting this stuff in the air, is to prevent the higher levels of UV radiation from reaching the surface. I mean, I'm sorry if I was unclear, but that's exactly the point I was trying to make, is that may be why they're doing it.
Well, I think that there's other explanations that are a little bit more readily visible, such as and measurable, such as the decrease in our magnetic field, stuff like that, that would be easier to explain the increase in radiation over the last, I don't know, I think that study 20, 15 years. It was also during the period when the ozone hole was very large before it began to shrink. So ozone, magnetic field, and solar activity, I think, are the three biggest contributors to that observation.
Well, but here again, if those things are true, if there's a concern about the depletion of the ozone layer, if the magnetic field is diminishing because of things going on with the convection cells in the Earth's mantle, if all these things are happening for real, and that is the consequence of that is a higher UV reading on the surface, could that not be a purpose and a reason for spraying reflective materials in the air? I mean, it seems logical to me.
Welcome back to the Truth Tonight Talk Radio. And again, Revolution Radio is, as I say every week, a couple of times a week, as a matter of fact. And just to remind you, it is, non-advertising here. So in order to stay in business, in order to stay on the air, we really do need the listener support. And I want to thank you so much, because so many of you have been supporting the station, and we totally appreciate it. As well, perhaps this month, we have a few things going on because the station is growing. I'm not quite clear on exactly, I might have missed a promotion that I'm supposed to be doing this evening, so I want to apologize to Hawk and everybody who works at Revolution Radio. I guess I've got quite a few individuals here on the show this evening in the background upset with me. So I missed getting some type of promotion apparently that I'm supposed to be doing. So again, my apologies. And I think my job's on the line right now. So this may end up being my last show. Apparently I've done something inappropriate by not doing a commercial that I never got. So I'm very unclear. And sorry about that to my guests for that notice. I'm actually a little in shock myself. So I want to thank some of the hosts that have been reporting me this evening. And of course, after the show, I'll find out exactly what I did wrong, because my producer doesn't seem to know either. So anyway, back to the conversation. And gentlemen, I have to thank you for taking over that last half hour and having the conversation that you have, because I find it very interesting. And if you could, please continue the conversation where you left off.
I'm getting old, Roxy. I forgot where we left off.
Did you already forget? Well, I was busy talking to the owner of the station. I've never had this happen in all my years of radio. So I want to apologize, because I don't know where you left off either, and that's not like me. Mark, would you happen to know where you guys, exactly what part of the conversation you were having? I guess we lost Mark McCandlish now.
Oh, no.
Mark, are you there? Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Mark, are you there? You're back. Okay.
I put my headset on mute while the commercial was going on, because I was laughing at some of the things I was hearing on the radio about dictatorships with the guy talking in the Middle Eastern accent there.
Oh, right.
Yeah. I've heard that before. It's a very interesting piece, because, of course, everything that he's talking about you'd see in a dictatorship are exactly the kinds of things that are happening in the United States in the last 10, 15 years. So, but the last thing that I remember talking about was the issue of, some kind of a material coming off the entire trailing edge of a wing, a large aircraft, jumbo jet, that appeared to be spraying something off of its entire trailing edge. And it was something that, it was doing the whole time that I could see it from, one horizon to the other, proceeding on a northerly path. I completely understand that Stephen is skeptical about, why this may be going on, or if commercial aviation is being used as an outlet for this kind of material being put into the environment. But if I was sitting in the position of someone in the government that had an awareness of some environmental catastrophe that was right around the corner, sudden escalation in the amount of heat, thermal energy, whatever it might be, that's coming from the sun, that could have a dramatic impact on the rate of snowmelt. For example, we know that the permafrost is melting and collapsing, and that the methane hydrate deposits on the sea floor are sublimating into gas, and there are areas of the ocean now where you can't even go with the ship, because there's so many air bubbles in the water that it no longer has the buoyancy to support a large ship. And so, these are all things that are leading to what I think is going to be a catastrophic environmental event, and maybe a threshold event where the ice in the polar regions is going to melt off so fast that we're going to start losing land areas along the coasts of many countries. And if that is in fact what may be afoot, what may be happening behind the scenes that nobody really wants to talk about, I can imagine that not just the United States government, but governments all over the planet are quietly conversing among themselves and saying, we need to do something to try and mitigate the amount of solar radiation that's making it to the surface, because if we don't do something fast, New York City, and a lot of other big cities, including Washington, D.C., are going to be underwater by 2020. And it doesn't have to be a lot of water. It could only be 2 feet, but that's enough to completely, decommission the nation's capital or, major cities around the world. And, I'm sure that, just like the possibility of a nuclear attack, if the federal government suddenly became aware of the fact that China or Russia decided to make a preemptive strike, they wouldn't tell us. They would just let the chips fall where they may, and that would be it, because the panic that would be caused by saying, well, there are some ICBMs coming your way, they'll be there in a half an hour. If it doesn't happen, the destruction just from the panic will be so severe that, it may be unrecoverable. But not doing anything, not telling the people over the long haul, to me, I think that that's going to be even more destructive in the long run. Especially, I mean, one of the things that they bring up in some of these strategic plans that I found, and I think I sent you copies of this stuff, Steve, before the show, was that they're really concerned about the possibility that if you have a substantial rise in the sea levels, that it may mean that maybe many of the naval seaports that that the military depends on around the country, around the world, will no longer be viable places for the logistical support of the ships and the Navy. The resupplying or even giving them a place to dock at the end of a tour of duty of some kind. So, I can see where this is something that they may want to keep under wraps, but I think that eventually, if it gets as bad as I anticipate it will, they're going to have to say something.
Well, the good news is we seem to be going into a global cooling period, and I think it'll actually continue. I don't buy into the whole global warming. I think some certain politicians want to make a lot of money selling carbon credits. And I just think that if the government's going to go do something to help us, I don't understand why they would do that at the expense of contaminating our soil and our water supply. It just seems kind of an oxymoron going on, a conflict of interest, if you will.
It's a lesser of two evils. I mean, losing hundreds of square miles of shoreline versus some aluminum in the soil.
But it's still, how would they do it? I mean, it would take such a large operation to cover the entire Earth with, this aluminum. And the fact is, if they're putting it in the fuel, it doesn't make sense. It's completely illogical because, like I said, I can be flying behind an aircraft and observe a long, persistent contrail. And I can see that aircraft descend and that contrail disappears as that aircraft descends into drier air. NOAA has a contrail prediction forecast map. You can see what areas there will be contrails and what areas there won't be. It's really just a matter of temperature dew point, condensation nuclei, and cold temperature and low pressure at the high altitude. That's what's causing most of the contrails that we are seeing. Now, if you jump to another subject, as far as government weather modification programs, are they practicing spraying stuff in the atmosphere? That could be. That's possible. I don't know. But that's completely unrelated to what you see in the sky every day as far as persistent contrails. A lot of people observe these persistent contrails just before a weather system moves through. And that's because usually when an upper-level weather system moves through, the moisture at the upper levels comes first before the moisture at the lower levels does. And so you'll see contrails and you'll see a hazy sky, and then you'll see the front finally come through. I just think this is average, well-known principles of physics that's creating these long-term contrails, completely unrelated to any other theory about weather modification, intentional weather modification, or anything that the government's doing. I agree that the government is probably involved in a lot of stuff. The HARP program, we have no idea what that's about. They won't disclose it. There's a lot of theories about what that may be about. And I think the citizens should be concerned about it. The regular weather modification, as far as what happens out west for, protection of crops, I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned about the environmental effects of that. That's legitimately going on. I just think that we need to be careful about the conclusions we draw based on, certain observations. I think that we need to be proactive in exploring theories that may not be what we subscribe in. I've tried hard to find evidence in support of chemtrails. I've looked through Case Orange. I've looked through multitudes of videos and talked to a multitude of people who have claimed that they have, liquid gelatin substance falling from the sky in a jar. I've asked them to send it to me. They never did. Maybe we here can create some kind of panel to, analyze this stuff, analyze this evidence, send these chemwebs that are falling from the sky to a lab to assess what's actually in them. I just don't think that this stuff is related to anything dealing with commercial aviation. In fact, I'm 99% sure.
You know, this is interesting. If I may interject something, I think that both of you, and including myself, the three of us, I should say, we all agree with one thing. We all agree that we need to clean up the planet. I disagree with a few things that have been said tonight on the show, simply because I do believe that there are certain things that get covered up and they get revealed years down the road. You know what I mean? I think Agent Orange is a perfect example. It's not revealed when they're using it, and then later, years down the road, it starts to come out. How our military men are treated when they come back from war. That's another big one. They don't reveal certain toxicities, chemicals that were used, let's say, in Iraq or Afghanistan until much, much later down the road. And they aren't treated, they're treated with psychotropic drugs to just keep them kind of numb and out of it on a number of levels. There are many reasons to, to distrust the government. Many, many reasons at this point. As a matter of fact, I believe in the polls that for the U.S. citizens, it's the lowest it's ever been as far as belief and faith in the U.S. government. So it's not hard, and I can see why people in the world get amped up and get crazy about things if they just get a piece of the puzzle. And I get it, but I also completely agree with the perspective that both of you have. Is there a way to unify and a way to direct this in a proper manner, if you will, so that we can get the government to do it? One thing I don't like about this is that it seems that the citizens have to back engineer everything, from GMOs to chemtrails to this to that. It's back engineer it for years and years, wasting time, instead of just going directly to the government and saying, look, you do your job. Hold the government accountable and say, you do your job. You tell us what this is and get back to us. What about that aspect? How are you going to stop something you can't see or know what it is?
Well, I absolutely agree with you, Roxy. When I look at things like the fact that Monsanto has created an entire spectrum of crops that are aluminum resistant, you
what
really,
a coincidence.
Yeah, you really begin to wonder, well, why is that? Well, okay, we know, for example, that there are certain aspects of the stock market where you can actually bet against the weather. There's kind of like a hedge fund process where you can actually put money out as an investment. And I'm not an expert on stocks or anything, but I know that these future markets allow people to put a tremendous amount of money into whether or not a crop is going to come across as a complete mature crop and go to market. Many times they insure these crops for more than they're actually worth, and then if perhaps something in the way of weather modification occurs somewhere on the West Coast, and suddenly you have all the moisture, all the precipitation that should have dropped in California, where we're now having a drought, coincidentally, all that moisture winds up dropping in Iowa or Missouri or someplace, and they have flooding, and all the crops are wiped out. Well, everybody who bet against those crops coming, to fruition, makes billions of dollars. And in fact, these kinds of hedge fund things have grown substantially into the billions of dollars per year now. It's a great way to sort of make a lot of money, and at the same time, you see that when these floods happen, and the individual farmers go bankrupt, and they wind up having to sell the family farm, who comes in and buys the entire farm for pennies on the dollar? Monsanto. And they replant all of that land with genetically modified organisms. So, when you see the link between what could be manipulation of the weather and billions of dollars being made when a weather disaster happens as a consequence of these modification efforts, you can see that there could be a link. There clearly could be a link between whoever it is that's modifying the weather and the people who are downstream, downrange, that are going to benefit from, the damages that occur as a consequence of those modifications. So the idea that Monsanto has crops that they've created, genetically modified crops that can withstand high concentrations of aluminum in the soil I think it's a big clue myself.
Right. And Stephen, what do you think about that?
Well, again, we kind of bounce around on different areas. I just the Monsanto and what they do to property owners and the geoengineered crops. I just think that's kind of I think it's totally unrelated to visually observing long persistent contrails. I don't think that we have the capability, or anyone has the capability, to modify the weather to such extreme to cause a large instantaneous flood or a tornado or anything of that magnitude to cause such damage and allow companies like Monsanto or local governments to come in and take advantage of the crisis. I think that's what it comes down to. I think these entities just take advantage of the crisis. We had a tornado a few years ago rip through my town of Tuscaloosa. Local government stepped in. They took advantage of that crisis and basically wouldn't let people rebuild. Their property devalued, and their friends that were property developers came in and bought the property pennies on the dollar and developed it. They just don't.
I don't know how you can, Steve. I don't know how you can actually witness that and not see what the potential in terms of a return on investment could be for someone who may have a link to the science that it takes to modify weather. I mean, even in the U.S. Air Force report on owning the weather by 2025, using weather as a force multiplier, right in that report it talks about moisture sequestration. By putting nanoparticulate matter into the air, you can actually cause a nucleation process to keep that moisture lofted, keep it in the air longer than it ordinarily would be, and then allow it or force it. That's why they call it weather forcing aerosols. Force that moisture to drop out in a targeted area. This is why the weaponization of weather is such a touchy issue with the federal government and the military, because they know how to do it. And so if you have people with billions of dollars invested in things like this, you have the potential for damaging property and somebody coming in and scooping up loads and loads of property in the aftermath of such a disaster. I mean, obviously someone, if they know, for example, that such a catastrophe is going to happen 2 or 3 days down the line, they can get their ducks in a row and take advantage of that situation. And this is something that I think really deserves a lot of scrutiny, because it's insidious, it's a heinous thing, it's something that we as citizens should be up to speed on, and I think that the main reason that these kinds of things are being kept under the radar is precisely because there are people out there that know about them and are taking advantage of the consequences.
Well, and Stephen, not only that, and to further that, and maybe you can answer this as well, Stephen. It's interesting as well how imbalanced our structure is now in this country. How the corporations, have really taken over in anyway from lobbying to, they're kind of in the power seat, corporations. And it's quite interesting, because I don't know how much leverage government has anymore. I don't know how much power government has anymore, especially because I personally believe that our government is systemically broken. I really do. I don't think it's the government that was set up to begin with, a couple hundred years ago. But anyway, with that in mind, Stephen, to see, I don't know. I mean, is it that you are a patriot and you just can't believe that this would go on in this country, that you just can't believe that the government would look the other way? And we've got 5 minutes, so go ahead and answer that question, Stephen.
Oh, no, I completely concur with your analysis that our government is broken. We, the people, are supposed to be the government. Yeah. And now our elected officials are bought and paid for by lobbyists and corporations. And there is a lot of stuff that the government does bad. I'm constantly exposing government corruption schemes and cover-ups. Constantly. I think it's a very far stretch to say that the government has the ability to control weather to that magnitude. I also don't think they need to do that. I think that they can use policies such as eminent domain and sustainable development Agenda 21 policies to go ahead and take the property.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
So I don't think they even need to spend the money and go through, the effort of such, to attempt such, godlike feat of controlling the weather to that magnitude. The manual by the Air Force, the Own the Weather, that, from what I recall from reading those reports, that had more to do with creating clouds for troop concealment, to hide troop movement from satellites, and stuff like that. I still think that they don't have the ability to control the weather to such extreme magnitudes as to create an extreme drought or an extreme flood. They do have the ability to do what Mark says, create droplets to mitigate rain and to create rain. They're just not really good at controlling. It's just small variations. The conditions have to be just right in order for them to affect it on a very small scale.
Which, I like what you're saying, Stephen, and I'm with Mark. I would wish and hope that was true, truly, because it does give power back to us, we the people, puts us back in the power seat to not think that they've really, built up this whole matrix of total catastrophes one after the other against us, and that we have no power. So I kind of like what I like what you're saying. I like where you're coming from. I really do. It's empowering. Listen, we've only got a couple of minutes, gentlemen, and first I want to thank you for the discussion, because I think it's just the beginning, and I would love to have you both back again to continue the discussion.
Oh, that'd be great.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, Roxy, and thank you, Mark, for having this discussion with me, and I appreciate you, being so cordial and everything. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Steve. And I have to say that I think the only way that people that are concerned about the environment and what's happening with the government, I think the only way that we can really make progress is if we do treat one another with mutual respect, even if we disagree on certain points. I do see common ground, and I think it's important that if I can do something to help you understand my perspective and vice versa, I think that's a good thing for us to be doing.
Absolutely.
I do as well. It was funny because when I first asked him to come on another show, he was like, "Oh, great, so you can slaughter me, or whatever." And I said, "No. I'm really interested in what you have to say." And so I'm glad. Excellent. And that's what I like about you, Stephen, is you are always looking for a solution, and it's difficult, as you said, because there's from your perspective, there's a limited understanding of what people are viewing. So I want to ask you, Mark, in light of what Stephen just said, do you have a different perspective of these lingering contrails?
Well, I do. One of the things that I wanted to comment on regarding something that Stephen just said about not seeing these things from his pilot seat's perspective is that I know that in certain parts of the country that the concentration of aircraft in a given amount of airspace is much higher than it is out here in the western United States, where a lot of the chemtrails seem to be witnessed. And it seems to me that one of the policies that air traffic control has, and Stephen, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, is that they try to keep the widest separation possible between different aircraft, even aircraft traveling along the same corridor. And so it doesn't surprise me that he has not seen these things, given that the prevailing weather patterns are generally traveling from west to east. And so let's say you were traveling from Los Angeles to Seattle, you had another aircraft out ahead of you 100 miles or more, and a contrail comes along or a chemtrail is produced, the weather patterns would naturally carry it away from the same corridor that he might be traveling on. I mean, I remember I've traveled quite frequently by air myself, and I think there's only been a handful of occasions where I've ever even seen another commercial aircraft from the window, of the aircraft I was flying in. So, but as far as the chemicals and the allegation that there's something being sprayed out of these aircraft, there's not only the constituent chemicals that are described in the original Welsbach cloud seeding patents, which involve aluminum, barium, and strontium, but these things are showing up in the snow and in the snow melt, the water that comes from these snowpacks in the Sierra Nevada. And it seems to me that, at least as a strategy for weather modification, that one of the areas where you want to put these kinds of trails, if you have any kind of a program in mind, is that you want to go into an area of regional instability, which is something we have a lot of here in California because we have two mountain ranges. We have both the coastal mountain range and we also have the Sierra Nevada. And so these are areas where the mixing process, if you will, caused by the uplifting of marine layer and air coming off the ocean is going to be quite a bit more intense. So it's a great place to kind of stir up the air and put this material into the air. Now, the interesting aspect about these materials is that they're not just an indiscriminate form of dust. These are actually nanoparticles. These are particles that are of a very specific size. They're all uniform in size. They're all spherical in shape. You can look at them under a microscope and you can see them. And so one of the things that's significant about that is that if you do want to perform weather modification and you know what the given size of these nanoparticles is when it's distributed into the environment, that you can actually paint these particles, the air mass where they are being distributed, with a particular frequency of radio frequency energy, radar, something like the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, HARP system up in Gacona, Alaska. These particles respond to this kind of material or these kinds of transmissions. And this is one of the same principles they used in the application of stealth technology, where they would embed particles like this in the pigment that they would put on stealth aircraft so that they would actually resonate at given radar frequencies and convert that frequency to heat, thereby reducing the radar cross-section of the aircraft. We can also see that these same particles, specifically gold and carbon nanoparticles, can be infused into a cancer patient, and that those particles can be stimulated, so to speak, by using radio frequency energy and actually heat up a tumor and kill the tumor, because these particles, particularly gold and carbon, will stick to malignant tissue and no other kind of tissue in the body. So it offers a new and unique non-invasive form of cancer therapy that was described or discovered by a gentleman down in Florida, John Kanzius. You can actually see news reports about this on the web. So, it's clear to me that, there's obviously something going on. I know that there's a tremendous amount of skepticism about it, but if you look at just the production numbers of nanoparticle manufacturing since 1990, it has grown exponentially over the last 10 to 20 years, from just a few $100,000 to well over something like $7 billion a year just in the United States. So you take all these things into consideration, finding the material in the snow melt, finding it in the soil, looking at the environmental impact of these things. I think it's clear that something is definitely being distributed in the air, and I certainly don't think that it's coming in this refined nanoparticle form from industrial production over in China. So, I honor and respect his opinion and his skepticism, but I respectfully disagree.
Thank you. And Stephen, with that in mind, is it even possible? Have you come across anything that could substantiate what Mark just said, that would actually maybe even help you to understand? I'm assuming that you've done a lot of research, Stephen, but to understand the possibility that, I think one thing I heard that you both agreed to You both agree that there are weather modification programs. So is it possible, Stephen, that these are Airways Express carrier? Stephen was born in Lockport, New York, and moved with his family to Tuscaloosa, Alabama, when he was 12 years old. And he attended Tuscaloosa Academy and Northside High School. During this time, Stephen was inducted into the National Honor Society Forerunners, which is a division of leadership in Tuscaloosa, and he received numerous awards for his performance in academics, art, literature, and sports. As a veteran of the U.S. Navy, also, Stephen gave 6 years of honorable service to our country, doing his part to secure our freedom and liberties. Knuessel was accepted into the prestigious Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program and worked to maintain and operate a nuclear propulsion plant aboard the USS Pasadena, a fast attack submarine. After receiving an honorable discharge from the U.S. Navy, Stephen pursued a career in aviation and attended Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, Delta Connection Academy, and Regional Airline Academy. Now, while at Regional Airline Academy, Stephen was selected as Assistant Chief Pilot of the Airline Transition Program. And in this position, Stephen was tasked with creating course curriculum and taught commercial airline pilots aviation weather, advanced jet systems, aviation regulations, instrument flying skills, aviation health, and advanced aerodynamics. So these two men have something in common as well. So this will be a great conversation. Listen, also, both gentlemen are all about our rights, our civil rights, our freedom as well. And Stephen took it upon himself in 2010 to move forward with trying to help America. Protecting the civil rights of the people has been his passion. So he will be running again for Alabama State Senate in 2014. So you might want to pay attention to his future as well. So firstly, I'd like to bring on Mark McCandlish. Mark, welcome to the show, and thanks for taking the time today.
Hi, Roxy. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you so much. And then, of course, new to the show is Stephen Knuessel. Stephen, welcome to the show, and also you're a busy man, so thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And Mark, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Well, thank you, Steve.
Now, listen, this is interesting. Stephen, I think that the public is very interested in your perspective as well. So we're just going to dive right into this. What interests do you have, or how did you come about, the conversation about, let's just call it chemtrails or geoengineering? These jet contrails that persist in some cases for days, hours on end, and so forth. Being that you're a pilot and very experienced, I want to ask you, what do you think about all of that? Because I know that you've been in discussion groups years 2013. Glad to have you one more time. And for those of you who are in the chat room, as you well know the drill, if you have any questions for either one of my guests this evening, just go ahead and post them. Now, being that we have two guests on the show tonight, please address the question to the guest in which you want the question answered. So, and without any further ado, I'm going to let you know about some background on both of my guests, both very intelligent and credible gentlemen. I'm real happy to have them on the show. The topic is chemtrails. What are they? And there are perspectives here, and I really feel it's necessary for us to know different perspectives that these gentlemen are, involved in. And we will cover the topic, all the way through geoengineering, chemtrails, weather modification, solar radiation management, and the effects that they seem to be having on this planet at this time. This program tonight is intended to educate our guests, and we will be exchanging ideas. So if you have something that you want to say or ask in the chat rooms, or if you're going to be calling us later in the show, I would ask that you have some respect. You won't be tolerated on my show. All right, and without going any further, we don't have any announcements for the Truth Denied tonight. We're going to jump right into the show. My guest, Mark McCandlish, has grown up in a military-dependent family and manifested an interest in aircraft and other modes of transportation from an early age. And this interest was augmented by an artistic and mechanical ability that initially grew out of the interest in dinosaurs, fossils, and science. So I think that's fascinating. And as a teenager, these interests shifted to cars, and Mark decided that he wanted to become a designer for General Motors. And he soon discovered that attending one of the premier automotive design curriculums offered in Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, California. And that was not going to be possible on the minimum wage that he was earning in the 1970s. So he went ahead and joined the U.S. Air Force and took advantage of the GI Bill, eventually passing through electronics school at Lowry Air Force Base in Denver, Colorado, and then on to his permanent duty station, McCord Air Force Base in Tacoma, Washington. And while at McCord Air Force Base, he performed repairs on bore-sighted, the infrared and radar-based MA-1 and ASQ-25 weapons control systems of the F-106 Delta Dart with the 318th Fighter Interceptor Squadron. Mouthful. His website is located on thetruthDenied.com if you want to. It's all linked up there. And if you want to take a look at his website, it's markmccandlish.com. My second guest who will be joining us as well for the conversation is pilot Stephen Knuessel. And Stephen is currently employed as a commercial airline captain for the U.S. Air Groups, trying to understand the subject matter. And what's your take on, let's call it chemtrails? What's your take on that?
Well, I have a unique perspective because I don't see the contrails from the ground looking up. I can actually fly up there and see what aircraft they're coming from and what's causing persistent contrails versus short contrails. And it's hard to explain it to people whose perspective is limited to the surface of the Earth. Because when people look up and they see one aircraft leaving a long contrail that persists for a while, and then they see another aircraft in the same sector of sky leaving no contrail, that's what kind of plays into the theory that, well, that one of the aircraft is actually spraying something. And there's a lot of confusion and disparity between the definition of a contrails, what's causing, quote unquote, chemtrails, and the significance of that. And so what I want to do is try to educate people on my perspective of what's going on through my education and background, and try to steer people towards a sensible solution that we can actually move forward on. The biggest thing is that those long persistent contrails are not aircraft spraying stuff. I mean, I fly every day up there, and it's just different. It's the same reason why you have a low cloud, and in the same sector of the sky you have a high cloud, and no clouds in between. It all has to do with the moisture content that's present in the air at that altitude. And it's hard for people to understand that because of the perspective on the ground. And the contrails, they are affecting the environment. And there are things that we can do to mitigate them. We can create a contrail avoidance program and ask commercial airlines to fly at altitudes that are less likely to produce long, persistent contrails. That's something that if we can agree on what's actually causing those long, persistent contrails, we can actually come together and come up with some kind of solution to mitigate that. The Air Force uses contrail mitigation programs so that when they go into enemy territory, that the enemy doesn't see the big arrow in the sky pointing to the aircraft. They're very particular about what altitudes they fly at, and they launch weather balloons and take measurements of the moisture content, temperature, and dew point, and they plan their flight paths accordingly. So I really just kind of want to discuss what contrails are, or chemtrails, if you will, and kind of try to clear up some of the misconceptions about it so that we can actually focus on stuff that's really going on, that's bad. Weather modification programs, they do exist. They're out in the open. We can work together to stop that and also to mitigate these long, persistent contrails.